So welcome, Peter.
Oh, I got this one here. Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Joanne, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. It's always a great honor to get to talk about your work and share your thoughts with people. So before we start, show of hands, how many people live on the water somewhere along Huron here? So, okay, so these are concerning times, as Robin has laid out. So what I'm going to do tonight is talk to you about shoreline erosion, build on some of the concepts that Robin has talked about and shared with us already, and then also talk about some of the work our company's been doing throughout the Great Lakes, touch a little bit on Lake Huron, but also some work on Lake Erie, as well as Lake Ontario. So it's a little bit of a smorgasbord here to share some knowledge with you about things that are important with respect to erosion, but also really important, taking that community scale approach to looking at adaptation solutions to deal with these problems. So first, a little bit about beach erosion and the water level graphs, and this is the one that we've seen already, a little bit from Robin. The black is where we were in 2018, 2019, and this range here is where the projections are for the summer. These are water levels on the y-axis here. This is the record all-time high in 1986. 50% chance we're going to get to that record. I'm not so confident that we're not going to get higher, so I'm not quite in Robin's camp on we might be at the highest level. I would really encourage everyone to be very cautious about the water levels this summer, because if we have a very wet spring like we did last year, we're going to be up in this range here. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been pretty emphatic about this with their projections, that there's a very high probability that we're going to be at much higher levels this summer if we have a wet spring than we were last year. So just be aware, be alert, because I think there's a good chance we're going to see some very high water levels all throughout the Great Lakes this summer. All right, and so again, beaches are eroding, as has been highlighted in the Huron. And the next couple of slides here, I want to just talk about the why. And Robin touched on this, the movement of sand back and forth. This is some work that we did over 20 years ago now on Lake Michigan, down on the sandy southeast shoreline. If you just look at the two panels here, the first one, looking at the black line, you see these barred profiles. These are slices or profiles out into the lake. We developed some tools that help us understand what happens to these shorelines when the water levels rise. And so the black line corresponds with the blue water level. And then the lakes go up here, in this case about a meter. What happens? You get all this erosion up on the beach, which is what we're seeing. And then that sand is moved by the currents and rebuilding bars in the shallow near shore here. And so you're losing sand up on the beach. It's being moved into the near shore to redevelop the equilibrium profile shape that we see and we know. And the good news is, again, that when water levels fall, the opposite thing happens. So the black is sort of the eroded profile with a bar system here. When the water levels go from blue to the dashed dotted line, we're essentially pushing that lake level down. The sediment comes back. So the good news is, again, if you have a healthy dune system, as Robin highlighted, you don't have a lot of structures in the way. When the water levels eventually come back down out of this high, the sand will come back on shore. And if you have a healthy dune system, you have a potential there to trap that sand and rebuild your beach. So this one, just a little plug here for the work that the conservation authorities do, and they have setbacks here for new development, and for good reason. These shorelines are dynamic. You don't want to be too close. You don't want to build your house on the dunes. You want to make sure there's good buffers, good setbacks there, so that these shorelines can go through these natural processes, and then it can recover from these high water periods. So when the Conservation Authority gives you guidance on where to build, and they want you well back from the water's edge, well back from the dune systems back in this area, there's good reason for that. It's so these systems can function in a natural way and build resilience for your beach over time.
Could you tell us what those numbers are at the bottom?
Yeah, these are setbacks. So
Dynamic beach allowance,
yeah.
something of
15, 30 meters. So the numbers aren't too important. These are not specific to your geography here.
because the water's 15 meters away from my deck.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sure there's a lot of people here like that.
Yeah, no, understand. This is a very challenging time for everybody in the Great Lakes right now, there's no doubt. Again, the slides will all be made available on the website after the presentation. Okay, so a little bit here on some shoreline management trends and some erosion mitigation ideas. So what is being done in other parts of the lakes for both shoreline management, but also to how to deal with these problems. So this next slide is quite busy, but this is a shout out to Environment Canada with some work that they've been doing recently on Lake Erie, focused on something called the Nearshore Framework. And this is a monitoring and investigation to look at the overall health and the quality of the nearshore waters of all the Great Lakes along the shoreline here. So these colored areas is where they're characterizing the quality of the water, the sediments, the amount of pollution entering the lake, the amount of nutrients running off and causing algal blooms, the human use of these areas, beaches, etc., water intakes, as well as the health of wetlands. And so a lot of really interesting work being done here at the lake scale to understand the overall quality of the conditions along the shore and how to take action and make improvements. And so this is some work that's just been finished on Lake Erie. The good news is that there's ongoing work now to carry this effort up into the upper lakes. And so this is some work that we recently finished for them looking at energy. And Robin gave you a good background here on the wave climate. These colors, the bright colors along the shoreline here, show you the changes in the amount of energy that reaches the shoreline because of things like fetch and the amount of winds blowing across the lake. And so these are measured in the legend here in kilojoules per meter squared. The units are not really that important. Blue is fairly calm. You get down to the red is very, very high energy. So with those long fetches to the northwest, a lot of energy striking the shoreline north of Sable Beach, sort of a moderate yellow down here where we are today. When you get down to the very shoreline down at the bottom of the lake, you don't have those fetches, and the amount of energy is quite different at the bottom of the lake. And this is just another zoomed out shot showing you what happens with Georgian Bay as well. So really building on this concept of fetch and wind direction, Georgian Bay being a much smaller water body, you have much less energy in Georgian Bay than you would along the shoreline here in the study area we're in today. All that goes into subdividing the shoreline into these units or regional units, which you can see they're colored here, where we're characterizing things along the shoreline to assess things like water quality, beach health, wetland habitat, etc., for both the shallow areas along the shoreline and then the deep areas out into the lake. And so this is some work that's ongoing within Environment Canada, and in a couple of years there'll be some interesting information to share with the audience here about specifically the overall health of the shoreline on the Lake Huron side. One of the other things that's a big driver for change, and we already heard about it a bit today, is shoreline protection. When we build close to the lake, as we can see in the picture here, often it becomes necessary to build shoreline protection. Or if you purchase a property where the shoreline is eroding over time, eventually you get to that point where you have to harden or armor your shoreline. This is an outcome that we see more and more in the lakes as they develop more, and we get more people wanting to live close to the lakes. But not without some significant impacts, and I won't go into that in a great detail today, but when you harden your shoreline, as we see here with the red line versus a more natural condition, the ability of these beaches to recover changes dramatically, as Robin has shared with us. And this is a graphic of the work that's been done across the north shore of Lake Erie, where we looked at all of the areas that have been hardened artificially with shoreline protection structures, whether that's rock or steel, concrete blocks. And so areas with the yellow are in a natural state, and areas with the red are areas that have been hardened. So these communities where there's more growth, the shoreline's in a hardened state. And a bit hard to see those graphics there, but somewhere in the order of 35% of the Lake Erie shoreline has been permanently hardened with shoreline protection structures. The good news is that there's some work ongoing to do this type of work all the way from Sarnia up to Tobermory. So again, trying to bring it back home to where we are today. We'll have some information in a couple months to share with you on how much of the shoreline from Sarnia all the way up through where we are today, Sauble up to Tobermory, has been artificially hardened with shoreline protection structures. Okay, and so sort of shifting gears a little bit to what to do when you have these beach erosion problems. And a nice example here, a case study from Lake Ontario. So we're on the north shore of Lake Ontario here, between Toronto and the Prince Edward County and the community of Cobourg. This is the harbor, a fairly large harbor here. The movement of the sediment generally is following the path of the yellow arrows there. They have a problem with the navigation channel into the marina basin here, where sediment's accumulating in this region here and affecting navigation. And we fast forward to the next one. The community went out and bought their own dredge. Our hydraulic dredge is essentially a floating boat that's going to move and dig up the sand. It's a bit like a water version of a snowblower. So there's a hydraulic plant here digging up the sediments in this navigation channel and pumping them to the beach in Cobourg here to build up the beach elevation and make the beach wider and create a recreational amenity. So again, a nice example of a community scale effort to take the sediment from one location where it's a challenge for navigation, and then they're pumping it along this line here out onto the beach to increase the overall width and the height of the beach. One of the things that we found this past summer with 2019, again, very high water levels on Lake Ontario, this is the beach in the summer. And so one of the things that they haven't done is really pay close enough attention to things like slope and then the dunes, as we've heard so much about today already. They have a very flat, wide beach, and they work very hard to make sure they till under any of the vegetation, which is pretty common in public environments. Open beaches, it's a bit like sort of the Florida thing. You got a nice little boardwalk along here, but you have a very flat beach and you have no dunes, no dune vegetation. And what we found in 2019 was that beach very low resilience to high lake levels because the water came in and just flooded everything. If you have, this is just down the way in the provincial park, when you have a more natural system and the dunes are growing and they're trapping the fine sediments here, you have the slope, then you have a system that can be more resilient to the high lake levels. All right, another interesting case study here on Lake Erie. This is in Erie, Pennsylvania. A sand spit here, quite a big dynamic feature, but had erosion problems for a long, long time. And this narrow portion here used to breach during storm events going back 100 years. So they're constantly having an erosion problem. Of course, they want the beach to be there to shelter this harbor basin. But this is also really the only public beach amenity in the state of Pennsylvania on Lake Erie. So it's a very important people place, as well as a habitat place for birds, et cetera, out in the tip. So they have an erosion problem. For 15 years, they were trucking somewhere in the order 175,000 cubic yards just to keep this beach in place. Year after year, 175,000 cubic yards. It's a lot of dump trucks rumbling through your town to keep the beach in place. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came in 1992 and built a series of offshore breakwaters. So these are these long, skinny rock islands. There was 55 of them that went all the way around the peninsula. And now, instead of 176,000 cubic yards per year, they only place 38,000, which is still a lot of dump trucks, still a lot of sediment, but a significant reduction now because they're able to break up that incoming wave energy and allow the sediment to move more slowly through the system. So on a community scale, on this large regional scale, when you have the financial commitment, that you can do some pretty amazing things like this. But I can't state enough, though, that these are long-term commitments. When you get into a solution of this scale, it's not a one-off. You don't just do this one time and then walk away. You have to continually commit to doing the maintenance year after year. And in this particular case, the federal government in the United States, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they signed a 50-year agreement that says we're going to maintain this beach and continue to put sand on it to make sure it's a public amenity. Okay, and maybe we'll just skip this one because I think we're going to hear more about dunes, but there was some really interesting information this last summer on Sauble where in the north, as people I'm sure everyone knows, a fairly wide beach here. There's been a lot of effort over the last 20 plus years to build a healthy dune ecosystem, and that beach was quite resilient last summer and quite wide. On the southern portion there where the cars are driving and you're trying to kill every blade of grass, there's virtually no beach left. Right? So this is the same beach cell, two polar opposite approaches to managing the beach and two polar opposite results as far as the beach conditions last summer. Okay, and then as far as protect, and there are cases where we put in heavy engineering structures, and there's some examples where we have some very large structures to protect these eroding shorelines. In some cases where we have infrastructure or roads along the shoreline, these are the right choices. They shouldn't be made lightly, but there are cases where sometimes this is the right approach. And if you're going to go that route of building these types of heavy shoreline protection structures, you definitely need to have a qualified coastal engineer to help you design them and a very good contractor to build them properly. Okay, so now on to some work that we've been involved with in the last couple of years on the impacts of climate change, and specifically the impacts of climate change on storms. What is going to happen? The question or the hypothesis of this work was, what do we expect to happen to the storms that generate the largest waves on the lakes in the future due to the influence of climate change? And so this was a study that we've been working on now for close to 2 years. And just jump right into it. I could talk about this for a long, long time, but what I'd like to do is really share some of the highlights with you. And this work, again, was on Lake Erie, so not Lake Huron, but I think the findings are relevant, and hopefully you find them interesting. So this is the Lake Erie long-term record, water levels from 1918 to 2020. So the blue line, very similar to Lake Michigan Huron, the water levels go up and down. We set an all-time record high on Lake Erie this summer in June. And we have periods of lows as well. Back in the Dust Bowl Depression era of the 1930s, they were low. They were low in 1960s, as they were here on Lake Huron. And then highs in the 70s, 86, 1998. When we look at water levels to do flood mapping or to establish regulatory setbacks or to design engineering structures, we want to know what the 1% chance flood is. This would be the flood level that has a chance of occurring in any given year of 1%. Sometimes it's also referred to as the 100-year flood level or the 100-year lake level, but that's a bit misleading because it doesn't mean it can happen only once every 100 years. It's more about the probability, and it has a probability of occurring 1% any given year. When we look at all the historical data on the lake, we come up with the orange line here. And so it's a bit higher because we have to account for storm surges, temporary, that short-term rise in the lake level during storms. And so this is the historical level due to climate change in the community of Erie on the north shore of Lake Erie. It's about 1.8 meters above chart datum here, the orange. With all the work being done through Environment Canada right now to look at the impacts of climate change on our precipitation levels, evaporation rates, ice covers, et cetera, their estimates are that these extremes, these highs that we see right now that we're in, we've seen in the past, will become more extreme in the future due to climate change. And the big driver there is that the warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. More moisture means more rainfall, and that will outstrip the losses due to evaporation. And so what the key message is coming out of Environment Canada, and they just finished updating the second study on this now, so they've gone through 2 iterations, technical studies to look at this, is that as we plan for the future, we can't only consider this historical record. We have to have an eye to the future and have an eye to the influence of climate change on the overall water supplies. And their recommendation coming out of this work is to account for higher highs in the future. So when you make decisions about where should I put my house, how high should my seawall be, what should the elevation be of the piers at the marinas, the guidance is to not only look historically at what's happened, but have an eye to the future and be thinking about higher highs. No one's really thinking about lows right now because we're in this tremendous high period, but on Lake Erie, the projections are that the lows could become much lower as well. So a little bit more on this climate study. We know that our climate is warming. We're looking into the future here for the 2080 period. This is our late century. This is for a high emission scenario, which is the track that we're on now. So we keep emitting greenhouse gases at the rate we are. The Great Lakes, the lower Great Lakes, will see warming in the winter on the order of 5 to 7 degrees. Right? 5 to 7 degrees warmer during the winter time is the estimate for the high emission scenario, but it's also the emission track that we're on. Now this assumes that we don't get smart and sort of mitigate climate change in some way. It means we just sort of business as usual and the climate keeps warming. And what that means for lake ice is really significant. And so the schematic on the bottom here This is Lake Erie when it's almost fully covered in ice. These are satellite images, historical images. The middle one is half the lake covered in ice, and only the U.S. side in this example. And then this is a winter shot where the lake is largely ice-free with the exception of some ice in the eastern basin. This is the projection, the trajectory we're on. If our climate keeps warming to this condition here by mid to late century, we're going to go from winters where we had lakes like this covered in ice to ice-free lakes. And again, this has been part of our study. It's also been something Environment Canada has shown, and as Robin highlighted, people have already measured reductions in lake ice cover. It's already happening. So this is not just a projection. This is something that's already happening, and by just thinking about warmer temperatures, of course we're going to have less ice. I'll just skip this one, but again, the projections are both the air, the land, and the lakes to become much, much warmer in the future. That's going to mean less ice cover as we move forward. This is a model output. So we can use computer models to estimate wave heights on the lakes. And so for this particular example, we have the wind is blowing from the southwest across Lake Erie, and the colors here, the color ramp, are wave heights in meters. So the dark red, 4 to 4.5 meter waves. Down in the blue, almost no waves. And so when the winds blow across the lake in this direction, this is a very large storm event. You get big waves in the middle of the lake. They keep going to Fort Erie. On the backside of the Long Point, you have sheltering here. Because the wind's blowing away from the western basin, you have very little wave action here as well. So we used a tool like this to gaze into the future to understand what can we expect to happen on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. We didn't do Lake Huron because of financial constraints. But on these two lower lakes, what do we expect to happen in the future with these storm events where we move towards a situation where we have less lake ice in the future? And the next map is the grand finale summary slide. Again, trying to give you the highlights of all this work and some key takeaways. And so what we did was use a numerical model, like the one that we showed here, to estimate wave heights every hour for 13 years. And we used the historical information from 2000 to 2013. And then we went ahead and made an estimate for the future using the winds out of the climate change models. And we made the assumption that the lakes are completely ice-free all the time so that we could understand what is the influence of moving all that ice off these lakes and going into that late century period where the lakes are all warm, no more ice cover, how much energy, what are the changes we expect to see in the amount of energy along the shoreline. And this graphic here is the summary of all that work. And so we took the amount of energy calculated in the historical period, compared that to the projected future conditions, late century, so it's 2080, 60 years from now, with the amount of warming projected, sort of the worst case scenario. What you're seeing there is what we call a heat map. And so, again, areas that are red are bad. Areas that are red, the amount of energy is essentially doubling in the wintertime. All right, so we're looking at Lake Erie. The shallow western basin is typically ice covered historically. You take away all that ice, you still have storms. Now those storms are generating waves, and those waves are going to generate more than 100% increase in the amount of energy striking the shoreline. So that means the fall and spring storms you have are going to happen all year now throughout the winter and have the potential to cause impacts. We move more to the North Shore in this area, it's 70–80%. So this has been a very important finding from that study because what it essentially means is that all the challenges these communities are facing are going to become more challenging in the future due to climate change because of the melting ice and the fact that we're going to have storms all year round. Now, we haven't done this work on Lake Huron. There's been some rumblings about maybe doing it. It'd be a really good exercise to do this so we have a better understanding of what to expect here on your shoreline. But I suspect that the trends would be similar. All right, so the last little section here, and I'll take this through this fairly quickly, is what to do about this. So in the climate science, the work we've done is telling us that we should be planning for higher lake levels and lower lake levels. And we should also be planning for more energy, which means higher erosion rates, more storm events. And so we used all that information for a case study here on Lake Erie, down on the south West Shoreline here, this is Lake St. Clair, Point Pelee National Park, Leamington. This is the community of Chatham, Canada, about 120 kilometers. This is also part of the lake that's sinking from Robin's. Really set this up nicely for me. Thank you, Robin, for all that great background on isostatic rebound. This part of the whole system is sinking, right? So the waters, the lakes are going up, but the shoreline's also slowly sinking. This is what the shoreline looks like here during a storm event along one of these very vulnerable stretches. All right, it's just a quick little video just to give you some idea. When you don't have a beach and when you don't have a dune, and the shoreline's eroding in front of your property, this is what can happen. All right, that house with the blue, sorry?
Is it gone?
The house with the blue roof is not habitable right now. Yeah, unfortunately. I have to say that this is a bit, I hope it's informative, but the messaging here is very grim. And I also want to just highlight the fact that people live in these homes, and it's a very serious, challenging issue for them. So I want to tread through this lightly and just be respectful of that. But these people are dealing with some enormous challenges right now. The funding for this was from Natural Resources Canada. We recently received some funding from the provincial government as well. The provincial government does not endorse our findings, but they did give us some money, so we're very helpful, very thankful for that. Chatham-Kent, Lower Thames, lots of conservation authorities participating, but really quite important, the community was very, very engaged in this work. We had 9 public meetings, over 1,000 people came out and talked to us and shared their thoughts, so a lot of engagement with the community. And some really interesting things with sediments here happening. So this is Rondo Bay. This is the photo from 1955 to highlight the changes. This is the Federal Navigation Channel, where we have these hard structures. They built these in the mid-1800s. They've been very successful at trapping sand, and you can see the progression of the shoreline in 1955 out to 2015 here. Unfortunately, by trapping all the sand in this region, they're starving the tip of the national park, or sorry, Rondo Provincial Park. And so in the last 150 years, the shoreline's eroded 650 meters here. All right, so this is where the shoreline was in 1868, and this is back where it is today. Right? So 650 meters of the park is gone, of the wetlands, of all the habitat, are just completely wiped out. I have a great beach on this side, but a good example of where we're not balancing sand accumulation and sand losses with a detrimental environmental impact. And this, just another highlight of sort of what things look like here. This area is breached right now. It's wide open. There's no beach here anymore. And this whole feature is moving progressively closer to the navigation channel. So we have a pending problem here where the navigation channel into the bay is going to be eventually closed off unless something is done. All right, and the flooding again from 2019, the fuel dock was underwater all summer, the boat launch was underwater. This is actually the tip of the rock breakwater to shelter the fishing fleet, which is here. And so it's almost completely underwater. And this is the gap out to the lake here. Flood risks. So how are we integrating this climate change information to look at extremes? So essentially we're doing everything twice. We're looking at the historical 100-year lake level from the measured record and looking at the amount of flooding here. And this is an agricultural area below lake level here. And this is the dike that has houses on it. This is the amount of flooding you would see during the 100-year event based on the historical data. If you factor in the risk of the higher lake levels due to climate change from the projections of Environment Canada, you can see that the water is flowing completely over this road now and right through all the houses. So much more significant damages when you factor in that extra half meter. And road access is a critical one too. And so the colors here are showing how much water is across the roads during these different 100-year lake level scenarios. So this is the community of Erie. The only way in and out of that community is along this road. And under both of these scenarios, the historical 100-year flood level as well as the climate change one, there's a point here where there's over a meter of water across the road, and it means there's zero access to the community. All right, so some real problems here with emergency access, ingress, egress. If someone has a heart attack in this community, there's no way to get out. And so these are some real problems. Climate change makes it a lot worse. This is 2.5 kilometers of this road is completely submerged if these dikes breach during that climate change 100-year lake level. All right, and so looking at damages, so we looked at vulnerability, how much, what's at risk in these communities, and the information here is the parcel database, so these are lot lines, the dashed lines, and then we have homes, primary buildings, secondary buildings, and we're looking at how many of those buildings could potentially be influenced by these flood scenarios to calculate economic impacts. And we don't need to go through all these numbers in great detail, but there are some communities that are much better off along the shoreline here, where there's virtually no damages, and then we have other cases where the amount of infrastructure that's in the floodplain is on the order of 18, 12, $10 million. So a lot of things at risk, a lot of buildings at risk. The other thing that's happening, and this is something that could potentially start to emerge in this region, especially to the south and the bluff shorelines. And so these are the bluffs, eroding bluffs in the study area. They have a road called Talbot Trail. 30 kilometers of it is very close to the edge of the bluff. And so you can see areas here, the road coming in close to the bluff, all along here. This used to be a provincial road, and then the province gave it to the municipality for free, and now we know why. The yellow band is the estimate of where the top of bank will be in 50 years. So a lot of work to measure erosion rates all on the shoreline, and they were making a projection of where that top of bank will be in the future, and where do we see problems with the road infrastructure, where that line's intersecting the road and causing potential impacts. The one thing about this to make sort of light of the influence of climate change, again, these are projections, they're the future. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the best science is telling us that these erosion rates are likely going to increase. Because if we go to a situation with no ice on these lakes, and we see that much more energy striking these shorelines in the wintertime, this may not be a 50-year estimate, the yellow. It might be a 30 or a 40-year estimate. So everything is getting more extreme, and more risk is happening now. All right, so looking at the buildings and the roads quickly again, we're using all this information on property parcels where we have building foundations, primary, secondary buildings. This is the lake here, and this is that estimate of where the bluff could be in 50 years or less. And so similarly, we're looking at what's at risk. What is potentially threatened by the amount of erosion in 50 years or less. And we're looking at different geographic areas here. This is that main section of Talbot Trail, 30 kilometers. In that 50-year planning horizon, 300 primary and secondary buildings will be impacted by erosion if nothing's done, for somewhere in the order of $40 million worth of infrastructure. So some big impacts here of what's with this erosion, and the big question is, what does the community do? And that brings us to the next slide, and we're getting close to the end, and we'll take some questions. We're working through with these, what we're calling climate change adaptation strategies. What does the community do to deal with these severe flooding and erosion problems? And we're breaking things into these 4 categories, different options, because there's always choice. Right? The choice of avoiding the risks in the future, accommodating, retreat scenarios, and I'll show you a couple examples, as well as the protect, armor the shoreline. So working through these concepts with the community to come up with options. And then in the areas, and you'll see some examples where the risks are becoming so great in this community, it's time to get onto the spectrum of what's called transformative adaptation. And this means really out-of-the-box thinking. It means path shifting, being innovative, restructuring these communities to reduce the risk to a level that's acceptable, and potentially reinventing some of these communities or transforming them into something different because the coastal risks have become too great and too expensive. All right, so avoid is where simply you stay out of the way. And these are some regulatory lines on a beach. The idea being that if you do anything in this community, you got to be on the landward side of these regulatory lines. And I'm sure most people are familiar with those from the conservation authorities. This is a really good strategy. It doesn't do anything for the places that are at risk right now, but it's very good for future development. Accommodate is staying in place, but doing something to reduce your risk profile. And so these examples, flooding, one of the easiest things to think about is just raising either the elevations of the home or maybe raising the home itself, or maybe moving the home back. But dealing with the flood risk in some way so that you no longer have water lapping at the door. Retreat. This was as recently as maybe 5 years ago, a dirty four-letter word that nobody wanted to talk about. But this is something that is gaining momentum as a serious option that people need to start thinking about. And it's also sometimes the cheapest option to reduce your risk. And so this is an example here in Chatham, Kent, where a person woke up in the morning and this home used to be set back from the bluff. The bluff failed right in front of the home. They almost lost the entire building. There was a standing provincial fund available to get emergency monies to move structures at that time. They were able to quickly get the grant, move that home, and put it back here away from the bluff. So now, 30 years later, it's still safe from this eroding bluff, and all they had to do was pick up the house and move it. Right. We also went through a whole series of generic options like building new shore protection, raising grades or foundations. But I've been talking a lot about relocating buildings, and you'll see why in a second. All right, so what do we do with this 30-kilometer section where the road, the coastal road, the main artery, much like your Highway 3 here, is on the edge of the lake, and there's also homes between the road and the lake. And these are conceptual ideas. These are not things that we're ready to build at any point, but we're taking the community through these options to help them understand what their choices are. So one of them for this section, where again, 30 kilometers of shoreline, one option is to build a really large armor stone revetment, a rock structure, and this is a schematic that shows what that looks like. It'll be hard to see back in the back, but you have a high bluff area here. You're regrading this slope and then building a very, very large structure towed into the bottom of the lake that will give you 50 years of protection. So that's one option to protect this area. It means keeping everything in place. You're going to keep the road in exactly the same place, keep all the homes in the same place. The cost to do that for 30 kilometers is $60 to $90 million. 600, yeah. 600 to almost $1 billion. The infrastructure that's at risk for the buildings is on the order of 40 million. Okay. The other option is to relocate the road, and this is that retreat concept, again, gaining momentum here in Ontario and especially other parts of the world, recognizing that there are options, and maybe one option in this area might be this retreat approach. And so looking at realigning this road further inland and relocating buildings one at a time as they need to be moved. You could relocate the road for 30 to 40 million. And you could move all the houses, buy them a brand new lot, build a septic system for somewhere between 40 and 68 million. So that's roughly 10% of the cost to keep the road in place. All right. So there are times, these are not easy decisions, if this is the route the community goes. There's no doubt there will be hardships for people that live along the lake if they have to move their homes. But looking at a very challenging issue, you have one that's almost $1 billion and one's 10% of that cost. All right, and there's some examples where this is already happening further in the Port Stanley area here, where roads, this was a coastal road here and it's been realigned already further inland. The one thing I didn't touch on at all with this concept, though, and the benefits of realigning the road is that you maintain all your natural coastal processes. So these bluffs keep eroding, they keep generating sand. That sand's moving along the shoreline to build beaches and other places. So we're maintaining our coastal processes as well. All right, real quickly here, this is some information on another really vulnerable spot, Erie Shore Drive. To give you an idea of some of the concepts here, this is an old map of the dike. This is a dike along here. The lake, the farmland is below lake level back here. And so this is what it looks like in a cross-sectional view. So this is standing on the shoreline looking out to the lake. We have a dike here. These are the 100-year lake level, 100-year lake level with climate change. We got a house on the top. We have a road. This is the agricultural land below lake level back here. This area is, because it was eroding naturally, and then we put houses on top of the dike, the bottom of the lake is still eroding. but people are trying to hold the line with the shore protection. And this is the video that I showed you at the beginning. The black line is where the shoreline was and the lake bottom in 1938 from the old map. If we look at the depths in front of this seawall, it was 2.2 meters in 1938. So big storm event at the 100-year lake level, 2.2 meters. Fast forward to what we just surveyed in this past summer, which is the gray line. It's a lot deeper now, very, very deep in front of these structures. If we factor in the higher water level due to climate change, we've got 4.3 meters of water depth during the 100-year storm. So the risk profile is changing dramatically because they've hardened the shoreline, it's eroding in front of all these seawalls, and now we have to start planning for higher lake levels. So we've gone from a water depth of 2.2 meters in front of the wall to 4.4, 4.3. All right, so what to do with this community and what do we do with this high-risk area? The dike, again here, all these homes along it, you could build a really massive rock structure. It would have to be so high that it would go up to the roof of the houses, as you can see here. And this would be an example. This is a power plant where you have very low tolerance for damage. You build massive rock structures. It could be done in front of nuclear power plants. You could do it in front of here. Very, very costly, $47 to $70 million plus forever maintenance to keep it going. The real estate is worth about 21 million. Right, so this is on the order of 3 times the cost of the buildings to keep them there and build that rock structure. All right, where are we going? I think as a community, when I say community, not these guys, because they're not my decisions. I want to really reiterate that. It's not my choice as to what they should do there. Our job is just to generate the ideas. But there is a lot of really interesting things coming out, especially the federal government, also on the international stage, about working with nature to increase resilience, nature-based concepts to deal with climate change. And this would be one example here. So this option includes buying out the properties along the lake, renaturalizing that area where all the houses are, and then putting nature back. This used to be a marsh. This once was connected to the bay, a shallow marsh area. So recreating a natural ecosystem so that you can rebuild the resilience of this community, because it's okay if the marsh floods. That's what marshes do. They get wet, right? If we don't have homes there, we can rebuild this marsh. The area in the top corner here with the little pink triangles, this is an area that's above the 100-year flood level. So one of the ideas being floated here is that you essentially make a big trade here. So if you're living on the edge here and your homes are being destroyed by storm events, you get a parcel of land up here to move to, and instead of being right on the lake, you're on the edge of this marsh. But you can do this for less than trying to keep everything in place. And then you've increased the resilience of this area in the future because it's no longer flood vulnerable. All right, my last, I think, couple slides here. Again, this issue, another area where we're thinking on that spectrum of transformative adaptation. What can we do to really recreate these areas to deal with these enormous risks, but also create habitat and create people places too, and protect the things we care about. So this navigation channel is exposed right now. This is the area that's breached. This part's eroding into the navigation channel, which is a problem. So this concept includes building this rock structure here, closing off this gap, and then digging up all this sand back here and putting it back onto the beach where it used to be. So that's part A. And then part B is building from that. We would need a rock structure at the back here that would be buried. Eventually you wouldn't see it. And then digging up the sand over here on the west beach, put with a hydraulic dredge, putting it onto the beach where it should be by right anyways, and rebuilding that beach using dune grasses and pioneer species to stabilize. Creating a habitat place, you're creating a people place, areas that could be enhanced for endangered species. So this is something we've been talking about with the community. I think this one's a real win-win for everybody because not only are you restoring the function of this navigation channel, but you're doing a lot of potential habitat creation in this area as well. Okay, so real quickly, what have we learned? And these points are maybe a little bit harsh, but there are perspectives of what we've learned, and maybe a little bit more relevant for Lake Erie than where we are here today. but some thoughts nonetheless. So first of all, our climate is changing in the Great Lakes. That is unequivocal. We know it's happening. From this case study that I've shown you and many others, there are locations where the community resilience to coastal hazards is very low, right? And that's not where we want to be on the spectrum. We want high resilience. We want to be able to bounce back from high water levels. We want our beaches to come back so we can continue to use these places that we care about. One of the other things that we've been doing now, and again, no one broke the rules here. We were told that we should look at historical extremes and predict the future. All right, so we would look at historical erosion rates, historical flood extremes, and then develop our communities accordingly. And what all the science is telling us right now, that's not good enough anymore because the climate is not stationary anymore. We have to start planning for the future. Building on eroding bluffs, on eroding shorelines, in my opinion, is a massive policy failure. And I don't know what else to say about it. Building a house on top of an eroding bluff is just a really bad idea. If you have one there, I'm sorry, but not something we should be doing. We could do so much better in Ontario. In our most vulnerable areas, like everything I showed you in Chatham-Kent, the solutions are unaffordable. These poor communities, these poor landowners cannot afford these solutions. So what are they supposed to do, right? So the lesson from that is let's learn from our mistakes and not get into that situation. So what's maybe a key takeaway for this community and in your shoreline and the developments you have? Let's make sure you don't end up in the situation they have down there on Lake Erie. Focus on resilience, focus on maintaining healthy beaches and healthy dune systems so you don't get into those problems. And then my last point for conservation authorities, the municipalities, and everybody that supports them, our opinion here is that those that embrace climate change now and plan for the uncertainties are going to be more resilient in the future. In other words, if we see all this stuff keep happening, less ice, more high extremes, the communities that are thinking about that now, getting ahead of the curve, making wise decisions about where the roads should be, where their houses should be, those are the people, the communities that are going to be in a lot better shape 20, 30 years from now. So this is about embracing where we're at and planning for a future so that you don't burden yourself with these massive infrastructure problems you can't afford to fix in the future. Okay, I think with that I'll say thank you for listening, and if there's any questions, we'll take them.
Thanks, Peter. Any quick questions?
So in that scenario where you're talking about retreating and moving properties back,
Yep.
what if the landowners behind aren't willing to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in the perfect world, you have a long, narrow lot, and of course that doesn't exist in a lot of places. So the reason we showed you all those homes on flatbed trucks is that it might mean you have to move further inland. And how that happens, where, I don't know. I mean, it's easy for me to wave my hands and say, you just move. But the reality is that if you don't have any more room left, you're either going to lose that building, or you're going to build shoreline protection that might not work, or you're going to maybe pick it up and put it somewhere where it's safe. Yes?
Are insurance companies looking at your modeling and uninsuring lakefront lots?
We don't work for insurance companies, but I think that they're really waking up to this challenge. There was just a summit in Ottawa a couple weeks back called the NatureBased Climate Adaptation Summit. And this is about, and it was not just scientists like myself and Robin and engineers, but bankers and insurance companies across all sectors that are dealing with these kinds of challenges. And it's time to start really rethinking what we're up to here. And do the insurance companies know that their risk profiles are changing? Yes, they know. They know. And it often comes down to dollars and cents with them, right? So.